So, hello, students of Global Studies. This is the second of our lectures for the course. And over the next few minutes, we're going to be going over what is exactly global studies, what is globalization, what are some key definitions of globalization, and how do we look at this grand matrix that makes up human civilization throughout the world. How are these institutions that we have built up over the course of the last 300 or 400 years, how have these come together to create this globalized world that we live in? What are some of the ideologies, the philosophies, just how we think about each other, that puts all this structure together, all these layers of meaning and institutions. What is globalization itself? What has made up this notion of globalization? And along with that, I also want to look at the methodology that goes into global studies, which is part of a larger culture of the social sciences and liberal arts. So we're going to get into that today. So, what is global studies, you may be asking yourselves? And I kind of wrestle with this question myself because it is a interdisciplinary field. It's really not a pure field in and of itself. Many aspects of the liberal arts come together to create this field of global studies so that you can focus intensely upon how the world comes together through many different models. So I think, much like history, global studies can be interpreted as just simply facts of everything that has happened that has put this world together. As a famous historian once said, it's just one damn thing after another, that how this all comes together. Perhaps a little bit better definition might be a study of causes and ends. All right, so anytime we're looking at globalization or global studies, we're going to be asking ourselves why things happen. We're going to ask how things are put together. How did a particular institution come to be created? How did it function? How has it changed? How has it changed the world? How has the world reacted to this? So in all this, we are studying causes and ends. We are studying change and why change has happened. And then I think also it is why something happened and how it has affected society that is so important within this definition of causes and ends. Thirdly, I think it can be seen as an interpretive social science. That global studies is going to ask questions about how the world works. And we are going to have to dig in to human structures that have been made over the course of time and have changed and have evolved. And this is going to require us to look at some economic models. We're going to have to read primary source analysis of how a particular institution or culture has been affected by something. And we're going to have to interpret this data. We're really going to have to put on our thinking caps, and we're going to have to dig in and do some critical thinking about this. So one of the skills I think that definitely comes out of global studies is learning how to read, write, and think critically, because you're going to have to look at a lot of facts. You're going to have to look at a lot of data. You're going to have to look at models, and you're going to have to read these. You're going to have to analyze them. You're going to have to write about them. And most importantly, you're going to have to think critically about them. You're going to have to do some interpreting, and you're going to have to make some judgments about events or institutions, or how these institutions and events have affected a particular society, how they have impoverished somewhere and made somewhere else rich. And then ultimately, has this institution or event, was it a positive change for human society? Has it created much suffering? Has it created both suffering and made another culture thrive? So this is kind of what you're going to have to delve into and make some interpretive judgments. So I think this is definitely one thing that global studies brings to the table, and it's something that you can employ in any career that you choose to embark on. Right, at any time that you are learning how to read, write, and think critically, it can only help you in any career field, because no matter what you're doing, it's going to ask you to have these skills at some point. You're going to have to read something, you're going to have to make a critical analysis of it, and you're going to have to write some kind of a report for it and present it to people and convince them why you're right. So this is some very important aspect of global studies that we will be using, and you can also take with you in any field that you choose to go into. And finally, I think, like the other humanities and the liberal arts, I think that global studies brings a particular art and philosophy with it. That you are going to be asked when you write something to make it beautiful in a way. You don't need to just beat people over the head with statistics and harsh arguments, but you really need to explain in an elegant way why something happens, and in a persuasive way. And this is really part of the art of the discipline. That you're creating something, you are making something through your writing and argument that is beautiful in many ways. And this is designed to make the world a better place. You're going to use your knowledge in order to help create a better world, to better understand, to educate people who don't understand about how globalization works or particular institutions. And how you present this is definitely an art form in many ways. So I think this is one key, or several key features of how the globalization and global studies methodology works. Now, as I said, that this is these four interpretive schools or ways of looking at globalization and global studies are part of a larger matrix of social, scientific, and historical methodology. So what do you do as a social scientist? You are going to ask a question about something. Why is there poverty in the world? Why is there poverty in particular regions of the world? You're going to then study that topic. You're going to read a lot of literature. You're going to analyze this literature. You're going to investigate the question of poverty. Where is the poverty? Why is it caused? And then after you have done an exhaustive and thorough researching of this subject, you're going to form a hypothesis or make a thesis. You're going to create an argument. And this is going to be based upon all of your reading and all of your analysis. And when you have done this, after you've made your hypothesis, you're going to marshal evidence for a written argument. That you're going to employ your readings, all the evidence that you have uncovered, and you're going to make an argument why you are right. And then ultimately, if you decide to publish, then you will submit your writing to a journal or a publisher that will peer review it, that there will be other experts in this area that will evaluate your work and determine whether it is true. And always keeping in mind when we make judgments about something, the notion of relativity within your own theories and thoughts, that you have to understand that other people might view a problem, especially in something as liquid or amorphous as global studies, that there's a lot of ways to look at something, and there might not be an absolute truth within these statements, or within your arguments. It might be you are right, but someone else could be correct as well. There may not just simply be an absolute answer, and this is what we're trying to determine within this is kind of how we can make arguments and how we can understand arguments, but we ultimately will have to decide kind of who is the most correct. And this is not always clear because people have different points of view. People will have access to grind, have their own bias within this, and we all view the world in a different way. But always keep in mind the relativity within humanities and social scientific models. So how do we do our work as social scientists? We look at sources, of course. We're going to look at primary evidence as well as secondary evidence. So anytime we look at a primary source, it is going to be something that is extremely closely related. It has an intimate knowledge of the event in its own time period. So if we are studying the question of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, we are going to want to examine as much primary evidence that relates to sub-Saharan Africa as we possibly can. If you were a historian and working on ancient Egypt, you want to read documentation, archaeology, anything that was produced in that exact time period. This is the strongest evidence that you can have for making arguments, because this is people right on the ground who are analyzing these things and who have experienced them, who can help you make much stronger arguments based upon this evidence. Next, we have secondary sources, which is anything like you and I who write a critical analysis of sub-Saharan African poverty and its origins. Well, we are secondary sources, right? We don't live in sub-Saharan Africa. We have not experienced poverty in sub-Saharan Africa over the last 50 years, or probably haven't, because if we had, we're a primary source. But we are writing literature, we are writing and producing scholarship that is about something that we are interested in and something that we have researched thoroughly, but we are just simply not a primary source of evidence. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have any authority, but it just simply means that we don't have the same kind of authority as a primary source piece of evidence has within it. Now, we have to, of course, use primary sources and secondary sources to formulate our ideas and to craft our thesis statements. But the key really here to forming your arguments is a deep and thorough reading of primary sources and supported by scholarly texts as well. The foundation of your argument should always be based upon primary evidence, and then, of course, supported by other expert testimony. And I've incorporated here what I would consider an ideal thesis statement and how you craft one of these things. So anytime that we go into a discipline or something new, we have to ask ourselves, well, how did we get where we are? Have other thinkers who have examined globalization or global studies or international relations, the social sciences, how have these changed over the course of time, and how did we get to where we are? So we want to know how intellectuals in this field have studied and understood human societies and culture over the course of time, over the last 100 years. It really helps us to understand how we got to where we are, and how this field of thinking within the social sciences has transformed over the course of the discipline. And global studies itself, as I said, is really an interdisciplinary field. What does that mean? Well, it means it encompasses an enormous scope of the social sciences, that it's a hybrid discipline that makes use of many methodologies in order to answer the questions and the problems that is presented within this field. Therefore, we might use sociology, we might use economics, we might use history, we might make use of any discipline that will help us to answer questions about these massive systemic issues within globalization. So basically, we're going to say at its heart that global studies is the art and science of explaining the present through the past, much like in history. So when we look at global studies, we are usually focused on the present, that we want to understand how things happen in our own time, or why they have developed as they have in our own time. But we can't always have a perfectly accurate understanding by seeing everything as being a progressive change to the present. This can lead you into cherry picking evidence in order to prove exactly what you think about the present. But rather, we have to analyze this development in a way that is, we try to be as unbiased as possible, and that we don't always see every change as leading us exactly perfectly into the present. That there might be a failure of our discipline, or a way of thinking, that a particular institution might regress rather than progress into what we see in the present. So things are not always perfectly going down a line of progress to the present. Though I think within global studies, we often focus on the present. We have to be careful when we analyze something like the International Monetary Fund, that it is not always just a massive arc of progress that got us to a sort of a perfect present. Be careful of this logical fallacy. So when we are looking at how human societies and cultures come together, we're going to be reading histories. We're going to be reading sources that are produced by primary observers. We're going to be looking at material culture. We're going to be looking at reports from outside observers. So all of this is either history, archaeology, anthropology. We're going to be looking at models. How does global poverty affect the world? Well, you just simply can't go everywhere and study global poverty. You have to sometimes use models, right? That you're going to see, okay, well, this is how wealth or GDP has gone into and come out of a particular country. So we're using economics. We're going to study the development of political institutions, so we will be using sociological models and political science models. So this is, as I say, just a hybrid field that we can incorporate all the best of the humanities and liberal arts, and we can bring them and deploy them for understanding this field. So how did we get to where we are? I just want to take a moment and briefly look at sort of the scope of the humanities and liberal arts, and to see how we got to where we are and why we are studying the things that we are. So long ago, before the World Wars, really at the end of the 19th century, really about 1870s, 80s and 90s, you began to see the development of professionalized fields within the liberal arts and sciences. And through this came the notion of the grand narrative. That what were people interested in the late 19th century? Well, they were interested in the grand narrative, that how we got to where we are, and how have we progressed into the present. So they studied great men, and I do mean great men, and politics, and how every change had led to this glorious present, that the Enlightenment and all subsequent developments had been a steady arc of progress that got us to the present. That democracy, that free trade, and that how all these things had developed. Who had founded these great institutions that had made the West the shining star, the imperial model of how world dominance and thinking, everything that was perfect came through the West through this grand narrative. And who were the great men who produced these things? Now, the only problem with this thinking about progress and the progressive arc of history, well, there came a world war that destroyed many things. And if you argue that we are progressing constantly toward a glorious present where we will get rid of all the terrible and nasty things in the world, and we will have a kind of a perfect world, well, then you can't have World War I, and then you can't say, well, it was just kind of an anomaly. Now we've got it all right, because then there was World War II. So on account of these two events, the notion of progress was transformed. And people became less interested, scholars became less interested in studying the great men who shaped politics and the development of political institutions after World War II. Then they began looking at the not so rich and famous. they began to look at those people who did the vast majority of the work, the living and dying in society, and that is the peasantry, the working class, and they began to examine how these people shaped history, and how they developed over the course, or how these people developed cultures of their own and were just as worthy of study as was the great men who brought the world to its knees during the world wars. And later, just shortly after they began to kind of look at the working class and the not so rich and famous, women began to come into professional studies in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and it was thought that it might be a good idea that we can write women back into the story of the development of humanity, and how women specifically played an integral role in shaping world events and developing cultures and within existing power structures. So there was an attempt within all the humanities fields to really study women and how women came to shape the world and their lives, what was important with them, and how they were such an important part of culture and had been ignored up until this point largely. Then there was an attempt to observe what I will describe as primitive cultures and how we could apply their knowledge to the present. When you attempt to understand something in history about the ancient past, you can look at a primitive culture in the present, and that knowledge can then help you to understand how things or how people viewed the world in a way that the modern industrial global world just would not allow you to understand. But across the social sciences, not just in history, the viewing, the understanding of cultures, of cultures that are different than the modern Western culture was seen to become very important because we were losing all of our individuality, and that it was thought perhaps that globalization wasn't the best thing because it was annihilating all these cultures that had lived and thrived in a way that was just different than an industrial imperialist model. So there was a great effort to rewrite this back into the story that things can thrive and do well when they are not part of a Western powerful culture. Then finally came postmodernism, which is a way of looking at the world that is very critical. It is very critical upon how Western thinkers specifically have come to analyze and understand categories, institutions, and really the emphasis in postmodernism is on cultural constructs, that scholars want to understand a culture in and of itself. They want to come to understand what it means for a person who lives in India to have experienced imperialism. And how do you do this? Well, you have to dig down deep, and you have to understand how people who were not powerful were subjected to power. You have to understand how these people developed cultures of their own, and how that they were valuable and a part of this story. And ultimately, it's very difficult when you are looking at these these societies because they are in a culture that it was so radically different from the Western cultures that studied them, that you have to really be careful when you read something, because when you see a stop sign and you're on the road and you stop at the stop sign, you should still be sitting there if you have read the stop sign correctly, because in the English language, stop means to halt. Um, and when you have a proper definition of what we actually do, it is rather to pause than to completely halt. So the same must be true for when you examine other cultures, because um, they might not always mean what the literal definition is, but rather it's a construction that can only be understood within a particular culture. So this is very important. And now, finally, in our modern world, that we look at new cultural studies, which is really heavily interested in race and gender and personal identity. Kind of what the individual, just hyper individualism, and very small niche cultures that are extreme minorities, but very worthwhile in studying and understanding how all of these particular aspects of human development have come together to make up this great global matrix that we are studying. So finally, within our methodology, I just want to encourage you to have to really focus in on three key themes. And that is, when you study globalization, when you study global cultures, you need to have imagination. You have to have the ability to be creative, to think outside the box, to bring in new ideas, to enhance our global community. This is a huge part of this, is you have to have new and bold ideas on how to improve the world and how you might think about the world. And I think you need to some degree, have some sympathy with other cultures, with institutions, how people have done things, people and groups that you're just simply not going to agree with. But you've got to have sympathy, and you've got to look at other perspectives. And you've got to do it with some respect and some understanding, and try to understand why people did things the way that they did. And then, of course, how can we improve upon that? But then we have to also see this part as part of a multicultural experiment. That we have to bring this all together, multiculturalism, into this big world, and we're going to study this through the lens of globalization. And we have to ask ourselves: is it good to have this kind of one world globalization model, or is it better to have kind of we have many cultures that are brought together through some means of exchange, but we really value that individualism within culture. So this is what we're going to be looking at in the methodologies that we're going to be using, and sort of our definition of what global studies is. So I want to continue by just going through some key terms and some key developments over the course of the last few hundred years, and how that these are brought to bear on our examination of global studies. So probably one of the most important aspects of global studies is going to be nationalism. And what does it mean to say nationalism? Beware of anything with the word ism on it, because it's a amalgamation of a lot of little understood things that are closely related. Nationalism is the creation of an ideology, how we think about ourselves through a nation-state model. Nation-states are political units that were born out really after the Reformation period in Europe. So beginning around 1520 up until about 1600, there begins to be the development of sort of national cultures and political units that were centered on these national cultures and ideologies. And how these came about were that everyone in this particular political unit spoke the same language. And I think that's so key within being part of your own culture, is that you can speak the same language. You can all understand each other when we speak. Within this also is that you had a particular religion. Lots of times that political units, the nation state developed around whether it was a Protestant or whether it was a Catholic nation. But now this has to be expanded to some degree, because nation states later came about in areas that did not have Christianity. Around particular rulers, but the nation state model is really something that comes out of the West, and is later adapted to, almost forced upon in many cases, societies that didn't have this nation state model. And it has caused many issues and problems trying to sort of create a nation state and just drawing random lines on a map in areas that were tribal governments in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, everywhere that imperialism went. They tried to create nation state models where they never existed before, and they tried to do this in ways that just weren't natural for these cultures. But nevertheless, Western nation state models were centered around these ideas, or around these commonalities of language, religion, ethnicity, and ideology, right? What you think about yourself, how you view yourself as being in the world. And these states became, over the course of time, to be viewed as sort of the secular state, that the state was superior to the formerly higher religious institution, the church. The government in this way becomes supreme. The nation state sort of becomes almost a quasi-religious entity in and of itself, that it was worthy of your devotion, nearly your worship, your money, everything that you have to give, that previously was given to a church was transferred over to the state. And nowadays we see this perfectly in our own societies, that a particular political ideology and the state have become almost religious institutions in their own right. So we also need to look at what is law. So when you have the development of nation states and institutions, you have the development of this thing we call law. So who makes a law? So if I flip back here, there's something that we call the social contract of government. That this is an Enlightenment thinking model that was kind of really brought into the main by John Locke. And it suggests that the people, whoever that might be, gives the state its authority, right? Its ability to do things, or its at least its theoretical ability to do things. So the state, in the place of the people, makes the law. So it is really the people who are making the laws through their particular representatives, or they themselves, but the state is making a law, which is sort of a binding agreement that everyone will follow, that keeps a society organized, and it keeps you protected. So if we have a law that protects personal property rights, someone cannot come over and just take your land and force you off your land. You can take them to court, and you can fight them through this manner. Without laws, you live in a state of nature, basically. Now, the law can be good for you, but the law can also be highly oppressive against you. So what makes a law authoritative? Well, that you have given your authority over your personal property, over your person, to the state in order to protect your interests. And the state will theoretically work for your interests. So this is what is giving the law authority, is the people have given it over to the state. What makes a law legitimate? Well, that it does not violate your personal rights. So we're going to come to a right. So what is a right, and what gives you the right to rights? But the legitimacy of a law comes from its serving of a particular group. And what gives a law its power? So we have to know the difference here between authority and power. We're going to come to this. But the ability to be able to enforce the law is really key here. When we ask ourselves, if you make a law, if it's just a law on paper, it's worthless as the paper it's printed on. You have to be able to enforce the law. You have to have the power to enforce the law. And ultimately, laws should be just, I think we can say. So we have to ask ourselves, what is justice? If we make a law to protect personal property rights, and a certain group or one person gobbles up all the poverty, throws all the people off the land, oppresses them, and builds a factory and pours poisons into the river that poison all the peasant classes that have been thrown off the land. Is this law a just law? And if all the people have come together to give this law authority, how is this just? And these are the kinds of questions we have to ask ourselves in relation to law. And this really comes back to our argument of authority versus power. And I've provided you here 3 key definitions when it comes to authority versus power. Authority, as defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, is the right to give orders, to make decisions, and enforce obedience. Power, on the other hand, is the ability, not the right, but the ability to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. So very closely related. I have the authority as a professor to banish everyone from my classroom. If I have 20 students in the classroom, while I might have the authority to throw you out, if you all get together and decide to resist me, I do not actually have the power to throw you out of my classroom. If I come back with 40 armed men and say, now you will leave the classroom, I now have the power to throw you out of the classroom along with the authority. So there's a subtle difference there, but I think it's a very important difference. Authority versus power. Now, within authority, you have the right to give orders. What is a right? And this, we will come back to this time and time and time and time again. A right is an entitlement to perform certain actions based upon their moral certitude within a particular society or culture. So for you to have the right to something, human rights, our legal rights, the right to bear arms, how do we determine exactly what is a right? And it's an Enlightenment ideal that gives you the ability to perform actions based upon justice as defined by a particular society. Because that society, that culture, has decided that something is just, and therefore it has enshrined this entitlement within its legal code. Now, we can call this a constitution, or we can just simply say it is sort of a natural law that everyone can sort of see and understand, that it is given by nature, it is given by God, it is given by whatever. But we can see here that there are these key definitions that we're going to have to keep coming back to, and so I would encourage you to be thinking about this and to be debating this in your mind. So what gives you the right to something? Is it because a culture gave it to you? Is it because it's enshrined within legal authority? Is there some deity that preordained this within nature, and it's a natural law? Did nature itself give you the right to this? Is it common sense? We just simply have to be thinking about these great questions. So we have come full circle back around to what is globalization? And I gave you this whopper of a definition of globalization the last time we met. But globalization, as defined by Manfred Steiger, is this. Globalization refers to a multi-dimensional set of social processes. So what he says here is that there is a lot of layers that are going into a lot of ways that people do things that create, multiply, stretch, and intensify worldwide social interdependencies. So these ways of doing things and ways of viewing things are elastic, that they are contracting, expanding, they are coming together, and they are increasing, they are decreasing based upon our coming together, social interdependencies, right? That societies are becoming closer together. And exchanges, that we are giving things to each other. This might be seen as trade or travel, something of this, right? That they are social interdependencies and exchanges, while at the same time fostering in people a growing awareness of deepening connections between the local and the distant. Basically, what Steiger's saying here is that we are coming together in ways that we never could possibly have imagined, even 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. That local tiny communities in the American Midwest can be connected to places all over the world. That you can start a business in a tiny hamlet in the Ozarks in Missouri, and you can ship your goods to people all over the world. You can travel. You can be on teleconference calls with people in Australia, New Zealand, Africa, all at the same time. That we can come together because of our technologies and creations in ways that just simply was not possible long ago. And this is bringing together our culture in a way that is unique to our time period over the last 40 years, 20, 40 years, that we are becoming part of these social interdependencies, these multidimensional set of social processes that we have created, multiplied, and stretched and intensified, that our local cultures are coming into contact with others. And this is part of this grand theory of globalization. And we're going to talk more about this in the weeks through more concrete examples, but I think that this is a good definition of globalization. It's a hard one to understand, and it's not very concrete, but it's a very good macro definition of understanding what we're really trying to look at here, and that is this putting together of our global community. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at some huge issues within global studies and globalization. And we're going to look at how globalization breaks down barriers and has, instead of relying on this nation-state model that came out of the Enlightenment, how over the past, well, really since after World War II, that there has been a concerted effort to create a global community in a way that just is different than time periods before that. There were many international institutions that were created following World War II, such as the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and we're going to examine the origins of these institutions, and we're going to understand and try to understand how these huge worldwide institutions have brought us together and have tried to create a globalized network of interdependencies that have worked to help us, but in some cases may have actually hindered the growth of local cultures, and that it has caused more problems than it has created solutions in some cases. We're going to look at the role of nations and nationalism. Is what should be what could be superior? Should the nation state, should local cultures be the nexus of government, or should it rather be focused more on these international institutions that our globalized world is part of? We are going to have to further look at the role of microcultures, of regional cultures, and these national cultures, and how these factor into globalizations. Why have we seen resistance to globalization? Why in 1998 was there a riot against the meeting of the World Bank in Seattle? That a massive mob showed up and tried to stop it. Why are cultures so concerned with globalization? And is this good? Is it bad? And we have to really understand why. And we want to understand how economic systems have played a key role within the development of globalization. How have capitalist societies, socialist societies, communist societies, how have these all come to play their key role within the development of the world, and kind of what is the trajectory for these institutions? What forms of economics will we see coming in the decades of the future? What will dominate the world? What conversations will we be having? Ultimately, we want to also talk about the role that human beings play in all this. While international and massive institutions and nation states and all this is very interesting, but we have to ask ourselves within global studies about human rights. Are these absolute things? There's the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Is that an absolute all over the world? And when those are violated, does it give the world the right to interfere in sovereign states, in local cultures? Who has the authority to determine a worldwide human right? We want to look at how humans have consumed resources, and why you buying in the United States of America a bottle of oil that is made from palms in Indonesia has caused deforestation and climate change. We've got to look at how our consumption of resources has changed, and how we can maybe do this a little bit better to make things a little more fair for the world, as well as be better for the environment. We've got to look at the environment. We've got to look at climate change, global warming. We're going to ask these kinds of big questions of, should we intervene in protecting natural resources? Should we let the market sort it out? Should we let nation states monitor this? Or should there be some kind of global coalition to protect the environment? We've got to look at modern communication systems. We want to look at how the internet, how the interweb, how this has all transformed how we live and work. How you can take an online class now instead of having to show up and learn how to understand global studies in person. So we've got to look at how the world has changed, and how these questions of artificial intelligence are going to change our jobs and how we do business. Will it make our lives better? Will it make our lives worse? Will it put an entire class of people out of work? What will this happen? What will happen because of our modern technology? And finally, we will look at the questions of war and peace, and why terrorists have felt it necessary for them to come and adopt radical ideologies to fight against particular aspects of world culture, world government, and when to intervene. Should we intervene? How should we intervene? We've got to ask ourselves all these kinds of questions within global studies. So I hope that you have come to have an appreciation for global studies and our methodology, and sort of some of the great questions that we are going to be asking beginning next week or on my next video. So I encourage you to really sit down and think about what some of these great definitions of justice, of what a right is, how you get a right, the difference between authority and power, and how these have worked in grand macro kinds of questions, but also right in local culture. what gives us the right, the authority, the power to do things, to act in certain ways, and how can we improve upon this? So until next time, thanks for watching, and stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.